My goal today is really to start a conversation about U.S.-China policy for the conference and to talk about why I think our Asia policy has been successful and why our China policy, as part of that Asia policy, as a key part of that Asia policy, has been successful, and how I hope whichever candidate wins the election, that policy will continue into the next administration. I think our success in Asia is really quite remarkable, and one way to look at it is to look at the positive relations we have with three major Asian powers at the same time. We have very good relations with Japan, we have very good relations with China, and we have very good relations with India all at the same time. And that might have been hard to imagine several years ago. And I think that there's something else that's quite notable, and I think this is what really makes this period quite distinct, that all of those countries have good relations with each other at the same time. That none of this beneficial relationship with the United States has come at the expense of the bilateral relations of those powers in Asia. And again, I think that would have been hard to predict. In terms of U.S.-China relations, they're very, very good. And I'll try to outline why I think our China policy has been successful. There is still a lot of problems. There are a tremendous number of problems in the U.S.-China relationship. There were several years ago, there are now, and there will be several years from now. But what I want to invite you to do is to look at the U.S.-China relationship as a movie instead of as a snapshot, and see it as something that evolves over time, and see if that movie is moving in a positive direction or a negative direction. And I think you'll understand if you look at the relationship historically and carefully that you'll see that it's moving in a positive direction. The key for U.S.-China policy, in my opinion, is to encourage China to make positive choices and constructive choices with China's growing influence. And that, I believe, has been the thrust of our policy, and I think that's the reason that our policy has been successful. Now, how do you do that? The first part of that strategy is that the United States needs to have a very strong presence in East Asia, diplomatically, politically, and militarily. And I think that that's really a keystone of the strategy of shaping China's choices moving forward. We need to have a strong military presence in East Asia. We need to have strong alliances and security relationships with our friends and allies there. And I think that's very important as a foundation because everybody in China wants to have China's influence grow. There's a consensus in China that China's place in the world should be more prominent over time, and there's not really much of a debate. The question is, how does China pursue that increased influence? And with a strong U.S. presence and a strong set of relationships in the region, it's less likely that hawkish voices will win debates within China about how to increase its influence. Now, I said that about the security relationship, and I wanted to emphasize it early because I'm not going to talk much about the security relationship for the rest of my talk. But that is in the backdrop. That is a foundation for our ability to influence China over time. The second piece, the part that I will emphasize in the talk, is the diplomatic part. You want to shape China's choices by urging China to use its increasing influence in all spheres for positive goals that help stabilize the international space in a way that benefits China, benefits the United States, and benefits the world in general. And that is really the thrust of our diplomatic strategy, which is founded in, I believe, our diplomatic strategy, which is founded in a series of dialogues that we have with the Chinese about how the world works, how it stays stable, and how to foster growth in economics, et cetera, across the board. And the two most famous dialogues in that set of dialogues, which is a very robust set of dialogues, are the strategic economic dialogue led out of Treasury, and I see my colleague Eugene Huang is here, that works on economic issues with the Chinese. And at the State Department, there's the senior dialogue, which is led by Ambassador Negroponte, the Deputy Secretary of State, and deals with security and political affairs. And there are a lot of other dialogues under those two large umbrellas, and they address a lot of different questions. And I think that dialogue structure has been incredibly productive, and I really hope that the next administration will keep those dialogues in place. A lot of people say we need to adjust things, but I don't know if they know the cost that would be paid if some of these dialogues were removed. The dialogues are real dialogues. What do I mean by that? It's not just the United States telling China what to do. We actually listen to the Chinese in the dialogues, and this is very important, and it's something that I hope will continue. China has a lot of diplomatic experience around the world. China has a different take on various problems than the United States does as a large developing country, and we have a lot to learn from China in these dialogues. And that's the spirit in which the dialogues take place. We listen to their concerns, they listen to our concerns, and I think that makes it more productive, and it makes it less likely that people will see the advice that we give to China as somehow a Trojan horse designed to keep China down, which it is not. What are some of the themes in our dialogues that I think make the dialogues constructive? The first is that the United States is not trying to contain the growth of China's influence. And it's something that the Chinese need to be reminded of on a frequent basis because of their history and because of their concern that somebody will try to steal away the mission that many Chinese share in their minds, which is to increase China's influence around the world. This is a theme that's obviously important in security dialogues to drive home, that we're not trying to contain China's influence, but it's also very important in the economic dialogues. And I would say the economic dialogues have a very positive effect on the security dialogues in this way, because it's very clear in the economic dialogues that we're trying to encourage China to make choices that will stabilize China's own economy and actually improve China's foreign economic relations over time. And that is very inconsistent with a strategy of containment. The second piece is related to the first and flows logically from it, and that is that we don't see the growth of U.S. and Chinese influence around the world as a zero-sum competition, as a zero-sum game. If China increases its diplomatic and economic footprint in Africa, Latin America, even the Middle East, it isn't viewed in the United States by those who think of the relationship properly as a threat to U.S. national interests. What the United States ought to do, and has been doing in my opinion, is to try to shape China's growing influence in those regions so that China's policies towards Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere are more in tune with the efforts of others around the world to create stability, growth, and peace in those regions, and not take actions that intentionally or unintentionally undercut any of those international efforts. So we don't view China's increased influence in Southeast Asia, Africa, and elsewhere with envy. And I think that that's an important thing to carry over into the next administration. The third issue is that the U.S.-China relationship is now much more variegated, much more complex than it's ever been in the past. And it's much more about third areas of the world than it has been in the past. And this is a very important aspect of our relationship with China in these past several years. In the post-Cold War era, there's been a heavy emphasis in the U.S.-China relationship leading up to this decade on bilateral issues. Taiwan, trade, human rights, and in the last several years, the relationship focuses more and more frequently on how the United States and China can coordinate our mutual efforts to tackle problems in third areas of the world, whether those third areas of the world be Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, the Middle East, etc. And I think this is a very positive trend, not just because China is an important player in the world and we need to coordinate with China, but also for the bilateral relationship itself, because it underpins that basic message that we want to work with you, we don't wish you ill, we want you to be more active in the world, but we want to coordinate our activities so that we can get things done together. In practice, these principles are an effort to get China to share more of the burden to make the international space more stable, to make long-term economic development a higher likelihood prospect for various areas of the world. And one of the areas is in Africa, where China has increased its influence economically and through aid policies. And one of the things that I think we need to get done as a nation with the Chinese is to remind them that we're glad that China is involved in Africa, that China's economic activity there can bring development to that severely underdeveloped part of the world, but that we ought to be able to coordinate China's activities better with the major donors and with the IMF and the World Bank so that our efforts are pulling in the same direction, so that we get the most bang for the buck or the most bang for the renminbi, it doesn't matter what currency, and we get the job done together and we create stability and growth in those areas. I think you can judge the success of our engagement strategy by looking at some of the policy areas that we've worked most intensively with the Chinese on. And I think, again, if you look at this as a movie instead of a snapshot, you will see progress. And why do I keep returning to that theme? Look at it as a movie instead of a snapshot. If you look at a snapshot of the U.S.-China relationship at any time, you're likely to see problems. You're going to concentrate on problems. You're going to concentrate on the long list of big issues that we have to tackle either together or in the bilateral relationship. And I think that that's natural. But if you see it as a movie, you see China moving in its foreign policy in directions that I believe would have been unimaginable several years ago today. And the flagship example of such progress in China's foreign policy, I believe, is China's behavior in the six-party talks, helping the United States and the other members of the six-party talks urge North Korea to move in the direction of denuclearization. This is a huge strategic headache for all of the partners in the six-party talks, but we do need to do it together. And I can tell you from personal experience that China has been very, very constructive indeed in that six-party talks process and deserves the credit that it has received from the United States and from some of the other members of the talks because of the efforts that it has made, being creative with proposals, helping break log jams when they occur. And we had a real rocky ride recently. I don't know the inside baseball, the inside details of what happened in the last couple of weeks, but my guess would be that China helped break that log jam. That would just be my guess from past experience. And that's an important role to play. And again, one that would have been hard to imagine several years ago today. UN Security Council resolutions with teeth putting pressure on North Korea in coordination with the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Russia. Hard to imagine. Sudan, Darfur, which is an issue that gets a lot of attention in the press, and justifiably so, because there is genocide going on in Darfur, and it's something that should concern us all. I can say that while I was on the job at the State Department, I personally saw a very sharp shift in China's policy towards Sudan, Darfur, that I don't think is sufficiently recognized in the public media coverage of this issue. When I was first on the job in July 2006, I could personally describe China's policy as telling the international community that if you want to put pressure on Khartoum, we are going to stop you. We're going to stand in the way and prevent you from doing that. By the fall of that year, China's policy started to change, and China started to align itself more with the UN efforts, Kofi Annan plan. By early 2007, China was putting pressure on Khartoum to accept the second phase of the three-phase Annan plan. And in the spring of 2007, China also agreed to send 300-plus engineers to Darfur, constituting the first non-African peacekeeping force in the Darfur region, which is a very significant shift from where they were earlier. They also signed on to UN Security Council Resolution 1769. And this is, again, a very positive evolution. There are still big problems. We think China can do more in Sudan, Darfur. We did when I was in the government. I think as an outsider now that China can do more, even though there's been a positive shift. And there's but there's consistent concern over the sale of small arms to the regime in Sudan while the problems in Darfur continue. In Burma, a place where we had even less traction with the Chinese, arguably, than we did in Darfur, there still has been, if you view it as a movie, somewhat of a positive change. China vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that was supported by the United States, and China has not been nearly as forthcoming as the U.S. government had wished at the time, and I believe as an outsider, again, that this is a place where China's policy could improve. But China made statements over the last couple of years about Burma that would have been hard to imagine several years ago today. China made public statements calling for reconciliation between the government and the democratic opposition and the ethnic minorities in Burma. And this would have violated the traditional principle that China doesn't interfere in the domestic politics of countries with whom China has good relations. That's a long statement, but I believe all parts are important. China doesn't interfere in the internal affairs of countries with whom China has good relations. And China has had good relations with Burma, but I think the Chinese came to the conclusion that an unstable Burma was largely the result of domestic problems there, and that an unstable Burma is not good for regional security and for China's own interests. And this is a good evolution in China's foreign policy, away from that rigid principle that I think limits China's ability to assist the international community in handling real problems, real security and real economic problems around the world, and in a more positive direction where China may be able to, over time, again, viewed as a movie, to participate more in such efforts to create more stability. Iran is more problematic still. And there have been quite a bit of cooperation between the United States and China on Iran to get 3 UN Security Council resolutions, sanctions resolutions on Iran. But my own opinion is that the process has been too slow, and that China has sent signals to Iran at the same time that the international community is putting pressure on Iran that its behavior is somehow acceptable. Whether that's intended or not, I don't know. But I can say that to sign new energy deals, or to try to sign new energy deals at a time when the international community is putting pressure on Iran, sends that signal to the Iranian regime, and I think that that's unfortunate. So there's an area where there has been some progress, but the progress is really insufficient. I would put Burma in that category as well. But again, these are real challenges that existed before, they still exist now, and we have to continue to wrestle with them. And the question is, how do you wrestle with them? And I think the format that I laid out is the approach that I laid out before is the proper approach to adopt in wrestling with those problems. In economic dialogues, we have a vast array of them. It counted 50 plus at one point. I can't name them all off the top of my head, and you wouldn't want to hear them anyway. But I told you about that big umbrella dialogue, the strategic economic dialogue led out of Treasury. And I think that we have some real problems in our economic relationship with China that need to be addressed on a constant basis. And I think that we have done a relatively good job with the approach that we've adopted. Again, there are a lot of problems, but we've seen some progress in some key areas. We have to deal with the problems of export subsidies, weak IPR enforcement, and the undervalued currency in China. I think all of those things are important. Any economist will tell you that it's natural that the United States has a big trade deficit with China. That's just a structural problem, not a problem, it's a structural fact. It's a bilateral trade deficit. And they'll also tell you that bilateral trade deficits themselves are not such a big deal from an economic perspective. But my belief, and it is, I think, the belief within the U.S. government, that the bilateral trade deficit with China is artificially large, that it could be smaller, and it could be smaller in ways that would benefit U.S. producers, and that things should be done to reduce it. So things have been done to reduce it, and I would argue that the things that have been done, a combination of dialogue, WTO measures, bilateral trade measures when necessary, have actually produced results, again, that you don't get a lot of coverage in the media. In terms of the currency, there's been about a 20% revaluation of the renminbi against the dollar since 2005, and that's had significant results, arguably. There have been other efforts that have also sparked the growth of U.S. exports to China. And if you look from the period 2001 to 2006, our exports to China grew 5 times faster than our exports to the rest of the world. And in 2006, our exports to China grew significantly faster. I believe it was about twice as fast, about 36% growth in exports, as our imports from China. And those are the current trends, that our exports to China are growing faster than our imports from there, even though the trade deficit remains quite large. And I think that's a positive trend. We've also had cooperation on air routes. There'll be a doubling of air routes between China and the United States, and I think a lot of people in this room will benefit from that doubling of air routes directly. There have been nuclear energy sales, which are good for environmental reasons, and also for U.S. businesses. And we've had increased cooperation on food and product safety, which I think is really important because food and product safety issues are clearly issues where both the United States and China share interest in solving the problem. There's no clearer issue where both countries benefit from a better situation, where we benefit from importing safer products and they benefit from the reputational value of exporting safer products, and they consume those products at home, so they benefit from that process as well. So we need to work on those issues together rather than separately, and I believe that dialogue, cooperation, technical cooperation is a better way to go than cutting off products and trying to harm the basic fiber of the U.S.-China economic relationship. Well, I'm going to conclude by talking about problems that I still see out there that we really need to address. And one of them is human rights and religious freedom. We've really worked hard on this issue consistently when I was in the government, and I don't see the progress that we would really like to see in the last few years. We address this problem like we address all the problems with China. We try to tell the Chinese that if they adopt the suggestions that we're offering, that they will be more respected abroad, which is a consensus goal in China, and that they will be more stable at home. that, again, this is not a Trojan horse to make China weak. It's a suggestion that should make China stronger. A freer press, more civil liberties, a more civil society should be consistent with the goals stated by President Hu Jintao that he wants a more harmonious society. We started a new human rights dialogue in that spirit, not a new one. We restored the old human rights dialogue in that spirit in the spring of 2006. And I think the meetings were very good at laying out our positions on a broad range of issues in that spirit, but we haven't seen the results on the ground that we would like to see. And we hope that there's a lot more progress, a lot more quickly on human rights and religious freedom in China. There's the issue of military modernization and the lack of transparency in that military modernization. And that lack of transparency is a solvable problem. We can engage the Chinese from our DOD and engage the Chinese military and talk to them about what they're doing, why they're doing it, what doctrinal shifts may be occurring. So this isn't some kind of mysterious, unsolvable problem. And we have started new dialogues with the Chinese military to solve the problem. The flagship example of lack of transparency was the anti-satellite test in January 2007, which came as a surprise to the world and which really damaged China's reputation in the security front in a way that I think many people in China understand at this point. So there have been some hopeful signs in this dialogue to increase transparency, so it's not a bad story, but this has apparently been cut off recently because of the arms sales to Taiwan. And the arms sales to Taiwan, something I support, is something that I don't believe should affect that dialogue. In fact, the whole policy toward Taiwan on the mainland drives home the importance of a dialogue on security affairs. And China's military buildup across from Taiwan on the Taiwan Strait has been a force for instability, in my opinion, and the U.S. government opinion. And they really need to rethink this policy, particularly with a new administration in office in Taipei, about the military threat and also the lack of flexibility toward Taiwan as it tries to increase its international space and its meaningful participation in various international organizations. Even in organizations where statehood is a requirement for membership, Taiwan can play a very active role in technical meetings, et cetera, and increase its international space. There are some hopeful signs on this score. There has been cross-strait dialogue, which I personally welcome and the U.S. government has welcomed. There's a reduction in tensions compared to last year, but there really hasn't been much visible change that I can tell on the military front or on China's willingness to allow Taiwan more international space. And I hope that that will change over time, because that will have implications not just for the near term, but for the 2012 elections in Taiwan. If a moderate strategy in Taiwan doesn't produce tangible results for the Taiwan public, they may return to supporting a more radical policy in the future that would be destabilizing. And the U.S. policy has been clear. I stated it in September 2007, and I support that outside the government just like I did inside the government, that what we really want to do is have a strong and moderate Taiwan. We don't want to have a Taiwan that unnecessarily pokes the mainland in the eye, creating problems in cross-strait relations and then problems for U.S. national interests. But we want Taiwan to negotiate from a position of strength and only come to agreements that the Taiwan public would support. So there's really no contradiction between a U.S. policy that fully abides by the Taiwan Relations Act and provides Taiwan with the defensive wherewithal to prevent itself from being coerced into agreements against its will, and a U.S. policy that encourages Taiwan to take a proactively positive approach toward the mainland on the diplomatic side, and to have improved cross-strait relations on political and economic affairs. And really, in my opinion, the ball is largely on the mainland court right now in how they can take this advantage of a moderate strategy in Taiwan and not overreact to things like to U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. And I'll just end by saying one thing, that I think the Taiwan relationship is really a microcosm, and U.S. policy towards cross-strait relations, which is probably the a better way to put it. U.S. policy towards cross-strait relations is really a microcosm for a proper overall strategy towards China in general. I think the United States needs to have a firm hand. The United States needs to have its partners like Taiwan be dealing with the mainland from a position of strength, so that nobody on the mainland can think that it can acquire China's goals vis-a-vis various actors, whether it be Taiwan or others, through coercive force, but rather has to adopt a strategy of diplomacy, economic engagement, and persuasion for China to increase its influence. And I think that at the same time, the U.S. has to encourage actors around the region of East Asia and around the world to engage China in those diplomatic and economic relationships that are positive, so that that strategy is rewarded in China, and so that the consensus view in China that we need to get ahead can be achieved in a peaceful and positive way.